This video is going to get into gene expression in relation to cancer. So one of the first things that I'll talk about are oncogenes. Oncogenes are genes that cause cancer, but they usually stem from a normal gene called a proto-oncogene. So you can see here we got the proto-oncogene here, and we have a cancer-causing agent, which could be anything from UV radiation from the sun to this is a virus. Viruses can cause mutations, even to chemicals. So what happens is these cancer-causing agents, they're called carcinogens. They mutate the proto-oncogene and turn it into an activated oncogene, which then can create a cancer cell. Again, cancer is quite complicated, and it doesn't necessarily mean that cancer will develop, but it is what we call a contributing factor to whether or not someone develops cancer. There's a lot of other checks and balances in place, which I'll talk about in this video. So proto-oncogenes, which are the normal form, remember, they control the cell's growth and differentiation. So they normally code for proteins that regulate the rate of the cell cycle. Remember, the cell cycle is the cycle between interphase and mitosis and cytokinesis. So in essence, they control the rate of cell division. So if a proto-oncogene mutates and becomes an oncogene, it can produce too many of these proteins so that it triggers cell division too often. Now, what results if cells divide out of control, you end up with something called a tumor. Now, again, a tumor also still doesn't necessarily mean cancer. It depends. I'll talk about that here in a second. A tumor is just an abnormal amount of cells in the body that result from uncontrolled cell division. You can see the picture there of a tumor being removed. It can develop in any part of the body for any number of reasons, but there are two types of tumors. The first type of tumor is called a benign tumor. Benign, as far as tumors go, I guess you consider this a preferable type of tumor. If you have to have a tumor, then you probably want it to be benign, because the cells that are dividing out of control, they stay within the mass of the tumor. Now, one of the things that I want you to notice about this picture of a benign tumor, a characteristic of a benign tumor is that the edges are smooth. You see how nice and smooth these edges are? That is characteristic of a benign tumor. And it can be removed by surgery if necessary. Sometimes oncologists, remember we have the oncogenes, onco meaning cancer. The type of doctor that treats cancer are called oncologists. Just like we have a biologist, right? A person who studies or knowledge of life, biologist. We have an oncologist, somebody with knowledge of cancer. So if the tumor isn't that big, isn't causing any major health problems, maybe it's growing at a very slow rate, the surgeon or the oncologist might decide that surgery is unnecessary. However, depending on the part of the body, if it's growing within the brain or within the spinal cord, somewhere where the tumor might grow and end up putting pressure on these kinds of structures, then they can go in and remove with surgery if it's in a place that's easily accessible. If you have a tumor that is, say, in certain parts of the brain which are inaccessible, then they might try things like radiation or chemotherapy to try to shrink the tumor. Now, the second kind of tumor is the bad one. This is called malignant. This is when the cells that are within the tumor are going to break off from the mass of the tumor. They're going to travel through the body, and they're going to cause tumors to be developed in other parts of the body. When that happens, that process is called metastasis. And that's when you officially have cancer, because you have cells that don't stay within the mass, but they actually leave the tumor and they start causing normal cells to start behaving as cancer cells. So it's not only that the cancer cells are bad, but they actually mutate other normal healthy cells. And so you might have a malignant tumor that starts off, let's say, in the lung, and then the cells from the tumor, they break off and they go to the liver, and then they start a tumor in the liver. And that's when you have like your stages of cancer, depending on how far it's spread. And then for sure, you're going to be talking about chemotherapy and possibly radiation. Chemotherapy is a drug that comes in liquid form, which they put through an IV, and it basically like literally just poisons the body. So not only does it destroy the cancer cells, but it also kind of destroys your immune system as well. So cancer, people that have cancer are particularly at risk for other infections, which is why they are one of the really high at-risk groups for COVID, because their immune system is being destroyed literally by the medicine that's supposed to help them. But yeah, so that's that. Okay, so even if you have a benign tumor or a malignant tumor, or you have proto-oncogenes which have mutated into oncogenes, your body does have a way to try to keep these kinds of cells in check. And one of them or one of the ways that your body tries to keep cancer cells in check is through tumor suppressor genes. These code for proteins that prevent uncontrolled cell division. This coming year in grade 11, we're going to start looking at human anatomy. And when we look at the immune system, you also have particular kinds of white blood cells that basically their job is to go around the body and to find cells that are not behaving properly and literally kill them. So we'll get to that in the coming year. So even if you have a tumor that is forming, or you have cells in your body that aren't behaving properly, sometimes the tumor suppressor genes can keep these in check. So in cancer, the genes for tumor suppressor proteins are damaged. So you don't have these regulatory proteins going around in the body and making sure that you have the cancer cells in check. Cells have 3 types of tumor suppressing genes, and all 3 must be damaged in order for cancer to occur. So like I said, it's a complicated thing. So you have to have cells that are not dividing when they should be. They're just dividing uncontrollably. But that doesn't necessarily lead to cancer, because if your tumor suppressor genes are normal, then those proteins will keep the cancer cells in check. So there's a lot of circumstances that have to occur for cancer to happen. So for normal cells, cell division is controlled by several factors. They have to receive enough nutrition. They have to be attached to other cells, some kind of membrane or even fibers between cells. That's one of the characteristics of the malignant tumor, is that they do not follow this rule. They break off and they go and start dividing elsewhere. And the third factor is that they stop dividing when they are too crowded. So you might think to yourself, when you get a cut on your skin, how do the cells know like when the skin is completely repaired? It's because they get too crowded. So you don't have this huge mass forming on your arm where it shouldn't. So normal mammalian cells will stop dividing after about 40 divisions. Remember when we talked about G0, the G0 phase, when cells exit the cell cycle and just basically just mind their own business until they're too old to keep functioning, and then they'll get broken down and recycled. But cancer cells will keep dividing even when they're densely packed, which violates one of the rules, and even when they're not attached to other cells. So here we've got, these are cancer cells that are dividing. You see, even though they're becoming crowded, they still keep dividing. And that's one of the requirements for healthy cells, is that once they become crowded, they stop. But these guys just keep going and going. So these are actual cancer cells that are dividing. Okay, so I said it before, but when you have a malignant tumor and the cancer cells spread beyond the site where they originated, that's called metastasis. So when that happens, cancer cells can invade healthy tissues and start forming new tumors, and you can basically have tumors all over your body. So what kind of things can cause cancer? Cancer, like I said a few times, it's a complicated issue because it can be hereditary, meaning that it can be passed down through the DNA. There's some cancer types that have been identified as being more hereditary than environmental, and one of those is breast cancer. So for the ladies in the class, I would highly recommend you ask your mom or your other female relatives what the frequency of breast cancer is in your family, because there is a gene in particular called the BRCA gene, I think it's called. And if you test positive for that, it means that you are at a very, very high risk to develop breast cancer in life. So if you have a high frequency of breast cancer in the family, then you're more likely to develop that. So then you can take steps to try to mitigate or to prevent that from happening. Environmental factors. You have carcinogens. Carcinogens are anything that increase your risk of cancer. Notice that I don't say things that cause cancer because, like I said, cancer is quite a complicated, complex process. So you just have environmental factors that increase the risk of you getting cancer. So tobacco, asbestos, radiation, these are all carcinogens. Most of these are called mutagens. These cause mutations. So just as an example, um, you guys all seem like good kids, so I don't see that you're going to be smokers in your future. And speaking from personal experience, I highly recommend against it because it's a disgusting habit. It took me a long time to quit, but I haven't smoked in probably 15 years, I think now. But just to give you some ideas about the disgusting chemicals that are in a cigarette, we have cadmium, which you find inside batteries. We have stearic acid, which you find in candle wax. Hexamine, which you find in barbecue lighters. Toluene, which is a very poisonous industrial solvent. Nicotine, which is an insecticide. This is a secondary compound that's produced naturally by plants as a chemical that will be poisonous to insects because insects are a predator of tobacco plants. You have ammonia, which you find in chemicals that clean your toilets. Methanol, which is in rocket fuel. Carbon monoxide, of course, which is a suffocant. It makes you suffocate. Arsenic, which is just straight up poison. Methane, which is what makes your fart smell bad. So yeah, like suck that into your lungs. Woohoo! Acetic acid, which is vinegar, and butane, which is in lighter fluid. So a whole bunch of nasty things. I think there's over 100 different chemicals that are bad for you in cigarettes. So don't do that. Okay, and then we have viruses. I've mentioned it before. There's viruses that cause cancer. Actually, there's a very prevalent sexually transmitted disease called HPV. It stands for human papillomavirus. This is responsible for a lot of cancer in women because physically it doesn't really display any symptoms in males as much as it does in females. In females and in males, but less frequency, it comes in the form of genital warts, which are like these bumps that form on the penis and the vagina. It is highly contagious. Public officials estimate that 80% of the entire population that is sexually active has been exposed to this virus. And for women in particular, the virus mutates the cells on your cervix, which is the opening to your uterus, and it causes uterine cancer. So that's also a problem and a big reason to use condoms when you decide to have sex if you're not having sex already. So viruses themselves, they can, the genes inside the virus can be actual oncogenes, or it can cause mutations in your proto-oncogenes or tumor suppressor genes. And so that in that way, the viruses can cause cancer. So what are the risks of developing cancer? It really depends. Like I said, there's hereditary and environmental factors. Like I said, some cancers have a more hereditary component to them. So that's called a genetic predisposition. And for carcinogens, it really depends on how much exposure you've had and for how long. So a lot of these farang that you see coming to Thailand and like spending all of their time in the sun, not a good idea because they'll be at higher risk for carcinoma, which is skin cancer later on. Speaking of carcinoma, the different kinds of cancer are named based on the kind of tissue that it affects. So carcinomas are skin and tissues lining the organs of the body. So lung cancer, breast cancer, skin cancer are in this group. So to give you some examples, that is cancer on the skin. Here's a tumor inside the right lung, and this is a tumor inside the breast. Next, we have sarcomas. Sarcomas are tumors that develop and form in the bone and muscle tissue. So you can see a tumor there. Tumors show up as being more white in x-rays. And finally, you have lymphomas. These grow in the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is a system that is connected to your circulatory system, which brings fluids from your body tissues back to your blood. We're going to be studying that this year. And leukemia is a form of lymphoma because any blood forming tissues is categorized under lymphoma.